The empire crumbled silently around him that Tuesday. Christopher's manicured hands trembled over bankruptcy papers, his 33rd floor view suddenly a mockery. "Billionaire faces bankruptcy" would headline tomorrow's papers. In the doorway stood William, cleaning cart beside him, eyes holding a lifetime of unspoken wisdom. The father he never truly knew was about to become the father he desperately needed. Christopher Harrington adjusted his tailored Armani suit for the 5th time that morning, a nervous habit that had intensified over recent weeks as spreadsheets turned increasingly crimson and investor calls grew more tense. The corner office that had once felt like a throne room now seemed to be shrinking, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city he had conquered but was now in danger of losing. He ran his fingers through his meticulously styled hair, catching his reflection in his desk's polished surface, the face of a man who had everything but was hours away from having nothing, a man who had built his reputation on never failing, but was now facing the ultimate failure. The reports were spread across his desk like fallen soldiers, each one bearing worse news than the last. Projections showing a catastrophic fourth quarter, innovation pipelines running dry, and competitors closing in like wolves, sensing weakness in their prey. Christopher's company, Nexus Technologies, had been his identity for so long that the line between the man and the enterprise had blurred beyond recognition. When people spoke of Nexus's brilliance and boldness, they were speaking of him, and when Nexus failed, Christopher failed. His entire adult life had been a relentless climb, each achievement a stepping stone to greater heights, each success feeding an insatiable hunger for more, but now the foundation of that climb was crumbling beneath his Italian leather shoes. Outside his office, the usual bustle of executive assistants and department heads continued, though Christopher had noticed the subtle change in their demeanor, sideways glances, hushed conversations that ceased when he approached, the palpable tension that accompanied a sinking ship. The Wall Street Journal had already published a speculative piece about Nexus's financial troubles, sending stocks plummeting further and making Christopher's odds of securing the emergency funding he desperately needed even more remote. He had not slept properly in weeks, surviving on espresso and anxiety, his mind constantly churning through scenarios that all seemed to lead to the same humiliating conclusion: bankruptcy. The intercom buzzed, jolting Christopher from his spiral of catastrophic thoughts, his assistant's voice unnaturally bright as she announced that the janitorial staff needed access to clean his office. He waved his hand dismissively at the interruption, too consumed with the immediate crisis to care about something so mundane as cleaning, but he didn't have the energy to object. The sound of the cleaning cart's wheels against the marble floor barely registered as Christopher stared unseeing at the latest email from the board, requesting an emergency meeting that evening, undoubtedly to discuss the formal filing of Chapter 11 and the public announcement that would send shockwaves through the business world. When Christopher finally looked up, he was startled to see the older janitor standing quietly by the door, not immediately beginning his cleaning duties, but instead regarding Christopher with an unsettling intensity that seemed wholly inappropriate given their respective positions. The man was in his late 50s, with weathered hands and silver-streaked hair, wearing the standard grey uniform of the building's maintenance staff. Yet there was something in his posture that suggested dignity rather than subservience, wisdom rather than simplicity. For a moment, Christopher felt an odd sense of familiarity, quickly dismissed as the product of his exhausted, overwrought mind. "Do you need something?" Christopher asked, the words coming out more harshly than he'd intended, the stress of impending ruin making civility seem like an unaffordable luxury. The janitor didn't flinch at the tone, didn't lower his gaze in deference, as most service staff did when addressed directly by the CEO. Instead, he stepped forward with purpose and placed a worn leather portfolio on the desk, directly on top of the bankruptcy papers. "I think the janitor said in a voice that carried unexpected authority. "What you need is someone who understands both the beginning and the end of a story, Mr. Harrington. My name is William. I'm your father, and I'm here to help you save what you've built." Christopher's laugh echoed hollow against the minimalist walls of his office, a brittle sound that masked the tremor of uncertainty beneath. The absurdity of the claim. This janitor, this man in worn work clothes with calloused hands and tired eyes, declaring himself to be the father who had been absent from Christopher's life for as long as he could remember, seemed like a cruel joke on an already unbearable day. His mother had raised him alone, working multiple jobs, speaking of his father only in vague terms that Christopher had eventually stopped questioning, focusing instead on building his own legacy, proving that he needed no paternal guidance to conquer the world. He had constructed an entire narrative around this absence, using it as fuel for his relentless ambition, and now this stranger was casually dismantling that foundation with a few simple words. "I don't have time for whatever this is," Christopher said, gesturing dismissively at the portfolio William had placed on his desk, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull, but security can escort you out if necessary." "Udi." The threat hung in the air between them, but William remained unperturbed, his weathered face showing neither anger nor disappointment at the rejection, only a patient determination that suggested he had anticipated this reaction and was prepared to wait it out. He reached for the portfolio and opened it, revealing meticulously organized investment statements, corporate documents, and financial analyses that immediately caught Christopher's professional eye, despite his emotional turmoil. "I've been working as a janitor in this building for 7 years, William explained, his voice steady and matter-of-fact, as he laid out papers showing significant stock holdings in Nexus Technologies, dating back to the company's earliest days. "Before that, I was at your previous offices, and before that I followed your career from its beginning. I've been investing in your vision since you founded your first startup in your college dorm room, Christopher. I've been watching you build something extraordinary, and I've been quietly supporting that journey in the only way I could without interfering with the man you needed to become on your own terms." The evidence was undeniable. Transaction records, investment accounts, a paper trail documenting a shadow presence in Christopher's corporate life that he had never suspected. The realization hit Christopher with physical force, causing him to sink back into his chair, his mind racing to reconcile this revelation with the reality he had constructed for himself. This man had not only been present, observing from the periphery of Christopher's life for years, but had been actively invested in his success, financially and otherwise, without ever seeking recognition or gratitude. The janitor uniform suddenly seemed like a deliberate disguise rather than a badge of servitude, a means of remaining close without revealing his true identity or purpose. Christopher found himself staring at William's hands, noting for the first time the intelligence in how they moved across the documents, the precision that belied their rough appearance. William continued his explanation, his tone remaining conversational despite the weight of his words, describing how he had built a substantial investment portfolio focused primarily on Christopher's ventures, diversifying only enough to protect against complete collapse. He spoke of market trends and corporate strategies with the fluency of someone deeply versed in business principles, not the vocabulary Christopher would have expected from a maintenance worker. The cognitive dissonance was dizzying. This man who had emptied trash bins and cleaned bathrooms was speaking like a seasoned financial analyst, revealing insights into Nexus's operations and potential that even some board members had failed to recognize. As William outlined his analysis of Nexus's current crisis and his proposed solutions, Christopher found himself listening with growing attention, professional respect gradually overriding his emotional confusion. The plan was sound, a combination of strategic divestments, renegotiation of key contracts, and a targeted innovation push in areas where Nexus still held competitive advantage. Most critically, William revealed that his own holdings, combined with a network of investors he had cultivated over the years specifically for this purpose, could provide the immediate capital infusion that Nexus needed to weather the current storm. It was not a handout, but a calculated investment based on William's unwavering belief in Christopher's fundamental vision, despite recent missteps. "Why now?" Christopher finally asked, the question encompassing far more than just the timing of this intervention. Why reveal yourself after all these years? Why work as a janitor when you clearly had other capabilities? Why care about the success of a son who never knew you existed? William's eyes, so similar to Christopher's own that it was now impossible not to see the resemblance, held a depth of emotion that made the younger man look away. "Because you're finally ready to hear me," William answered simply, reaching across the desk not to touch the corporate documents, but to place his hand briefly on Christopher's arm, a gesture so unexpected that Christopher didn't think to pull away. "You've built something remarkable, but you've built it believing you were alone. You don't have to face this crisis alone, son. Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to accept help." The emergency board meeting that evening unfolded nothing like Christopher had anticipated when he'd received the summons earlier that day. Instead of presiding over the corporate equivalent of a funeral, he found himself presenting a comprehensive, restructuring plan with a confidence that felt both foreign and familiar, as if he were channeling a strength he'd always possessed but never fully accessed. William stood unobtrusively at the back of the boardroom, still in his janitor's uniform, apparently there to refill water pitchers and adjust the temperature. But Christopher felt his presence like an anchor, keeping him steady as he navigated the skeptical questions and doubtful expressions of board members who had already written Nexus's epitaph in their minds. The financial package William had assembled was presented as coming from a consortium of private investors who preferred to remain anonymous, an explanation that raised eyebrows but was ultimately accepted in light of the immediate crisis. Christopher watched the shift in the room as numbers were examined, projections recalculated, and the possibility of salvation began to seem increasingly plausible rather than hopelessly naive. He found himself speaking with a wisdom beyond his years, addressing concerns with a humility that had previously been foreign to his leadership style, acknowledging past mistakes while articulating a path forward that balanced ambition with pragmatism in a way that resonated with even his harshest critics on the board. Later, as the boardroom emptied, and the immediate threat of bankruptcy had transformed into a challenging but navigable reorganization, Christopher found himself alone with William, the pretense of janitorial duties abandoned as father and son faced each other across the polished table. The questions that had been suppressed during the urgency of the business crisis now rose to the surface, a lifetime of absence demanding explanation. Christopher's voice was raw with emotion as he asked about his mother, about the circumstances of their separation, about the choices that had led to a father watching his son's life unfold from behind the invisibility cloak of menial employment, present but unreachable, connected but unknown. William's story emerged gradually, not as a rehearsed justification, but as a painful chronicle of good intentions, poor timing, and the complex interplay of pride and love. He'd been young and ambitious once too, pursuing business ventures that had ultimately failed, accumulating debts that had made him feel unworthy of fatherhood, convinced that his presence in Christopher's life would be a burden rather than a blessing. His initial intention to step away temporarily until he could return with something to offer had calcified into years of absence, each passing month making it harder to bridge the growing gap, each of Christopher's independent successes seeming to confirm that his son was better off without the complication of a father who had failed where Christopher was so clearly succeeding. The janitor position had begun as a way to simply see his son, to verify with his own eyes that Christopher was thriving, but had evolved into something more profound, a vantage point from which William could observe not just the public success, but the private toll it took, the isolation that accompanied Christopher's rise to prominence, the relationships sacrificed on the altar of ambition. William had cleaned Christopher's office late at night, noting the empty takeout containers that revealed solitary meals, the unused guest chairs that spoke of decisions made without counsel, the gradual hardening of a brilliant young man into someone who trusted only himself because he believed that was all he had ever had. Christopher listened with growing understanding, his initial anger at the deception giving way to a more complex emotion as he recognized the profound nature of the sacrifice his father had made. Not just the financial investment in his companies, which represented nearly everything William had, but the greater sacrifice of remaining in the shadows, forgoing recognition or gratitude, enduring the indignities of being invisible to his own son, for the sake of allowing that son to forge his own path. There was a selflessness to it that challenged Christopher's understanding of love, so different from the transactional relationships that characterized his adult life, where affection and loyalty were commodities to be earned through demonstrable value rather than freely given without expectation of return. As night deepened beyond the boardroom windows, father and son began the delicate work of bridge building across the chasm of lost years, speaking not just of business strategy for Nexus's recovery, but of memories that only one of them had. William describing moments he had witnessed from afar, Christopher hearing for the first time about his own life from the perspective of someone who had observed it with the unique combination of pride and concern that perhaps only a parent could feel. The revelation that he had never been truly alone, even when he had felt most isolated, was reshaping Christopher's understanding of his own journey, suggesting that the narrative of self-made success he had clung to so fiercely was both true and incomplete. "Tomorrow," William said, as their conversation finally wound down in the early hours of the morning, both men exhausted but reluctant to bring this first real connection to an end. "You'll need to announce the restructuring plan to the company. Your employees are frightened, Christopher. They need to see not just that the company has a future, but that its leader has a heart." He stood up, automatically straightening the boardroom chairs out of habit, the janitor's role not entirely abandoned despite the transformation of their relationship. "For years, I've watched you build something impressive, but now I want to help you build something meaningful. There's a difference." Christopher nodded, understanding for the first time that the crisis threatening his company might actually be the foundation of something far more valuable than what he had originally built. The weeks that followed transformed Nexus Technologies with a speed and thoroughness that astonished industry observers, financial analysts, and employees alike. The bankruptcy that had seemed inevitable became instead a corporate reinvention, with strategic changes implemented not as desperate measures, but as deliberate evolution. Christopher moved through the company with a new presence, no longer the isolated figure issuing edicts from on high, but a leader engaged with every level of the organization, listening more than speaking, learning the names and concerns of employees who had previously been interchangeable components in his corporate machine. The change was most noticeable in meetings, where Christopher now left the head seat empty, choosing instead to sit among his team, a symbolic shift that reflected a fundamental change in how he viewed leadership. William's influence was everywhere. Though his official role remained ambiguous to most, he had shed the janitor's uniform but maintained a low profile, attending key meetings as Christopher's strategic advisor, but often choosing to observe rather than direct. The wisdom he offered came not in the form of dramatic interventions, but quiet conversations, thoughtful questions that guided Christopher toward his own realizations, rather than imposing external solutions. There was an alchemy in their combined approach. Christopher's visionary drive and market instincts balanced by William's patient perspective and human understanding, creating a leadership dynamic that began to attract attention beyond the immediate crisis management. With business publications speculating about the mysterious mentor who had appeared in the billionaire's life at such a critical juncture, the narrative Christopher had constructed about himself required significant revision, a process both painful and liberating as he acknowledged the costs of his previous approach, the broken relationships, the colleagues discarded when they no longer served his purpose, the narrow definition of success that had left him wealthy but isolated. Board meetings now included discussions not just of profit margins and market share, but of corporate culture and social impact, with William gently but persistently expanding the conversation beyond quarterly results to legacy considerations that had previously seemed like luxury concerns for a company focused on survival and domination. The irony was not lost on Christopher that in addressing these supposedly soft factors, the hard metrics of the business were showing marked improvement. On a rare evening when both men left the office before midnight, they walked through the city streets together, the anonymity of urban darkness allowing for a conversation impossible in the corporate environment where eyes and ears were everywhere. William spoke of his own father, Christopher's grandfather, a man of principle who had valued integrity above achievement, who had taught William lessons that he had failed to live by in his younger years, but had tried to honor in his unconventional approach to fatherhood. There was a generational wisdom being recovered in their relationship, Christopher realized, a perspective that extended beyond quarterly earnings or even individual lifetimes, to consider what it meant to build something worthy of continuation, something that enriched rather than extracted. "I want you to take a formal position in the company," Christopher said, as they paused at a viewpoint overlooking the city lights, the Nexus headquarters building prominent among them, its illuminated logo a beacon in the urban landscape. "Chief Strategy Officer or Executive Chairman, whatever title you want, it's time you stepped out of the shadows. You've earned it." The offer was genuine, motivated not by obligation, but by recognition of William's value. Yet Christopher saw immediate reluctance in his father's expression, a hesitation that seemed at odds with the natural culmination of their story. William's response, when it came, revealed a depth of understanding that Christopher was only beginning to grasp, that their journey together wasn't about restoring William to a position of authority or traditional success, but about helping Christopher find a balanced center from which true leadership could emerge. William declined the executive position, but accepted a role on the Nexus Foundation Board, the philanthropic arm of the company that Christopher had established years ago as a tax strategy, but had never given significant attention. Under William's guidance, the foundation was being revitalized with a mission focused on educational opportunities for disadvantaged youth and second chances for those whose early mistakes might otherwise define their entire lives. It was work that held personal meaning for William, allowing him to transform his own regrets into positive action while teaching Christopher that a leader's impact could extend far beyond balance sheets and market capitalization. Together, they were redefining what constituted the Harrington legacy, expanding it from corporate achievement to include human connection and community contribution. As dawn approached, father and son made their way back to the Nexus building, entering through the service entrance that William had used for years, a symbolic acknowledgement of the path that had brought them to this point. The cleaning staff was starting their early morning shift, and Christopher watched with new eyes as William greeted each person by name, inquiring about families and concerns with a genuine interest that revealed these relationships had been real and meaningful during his years of disguised presence. There was a lesson in this too, that value and dignity existed at every level of the organization, that the measure of a person was not in their title or office location, but in how they treated others, regardless of what those others could do for them. Christopher realized with sudden clarity that in saving his company, his father had given him something far more precious, a chance to become not just a better businessman, but a better man.